The sterile, almost surgical quiet of Sophie Albright's compact apartment at precisely 11:47 p.m. was a deliberate choice, a stark and necessary counterpoint to the relentless, often disorienting cacophony of airport terminals, the roaring symphony of jet engines, and the high-stakes, pressure cooker world of aviation compliance. Her living space, a testament to unadorned utilitarianism, mirrored her own disciplined, highly organized nature. Every surface gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting, meticulously free of clutter. An ergonomic desk chair, perfectly positioned, faced a minimalist desk where a high-resolution monitor displayed an intricate web of spreadsheets, dense FAA regulations, and stacks of meticulously organized audit reports. Every item in her apartment served a precise, calculated purpose, much like Sophie herself. At 37 years old, Sophie was a senior inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, a role that demanded an almost obsessive attention to detail, an unshakable adherence to protocols, and a quiet, relentless pursuit of perfection that bordered on the fanatical. Within the intricate labyrinth of the FAA, her reputation preceded her. She was known, though rarely to her face, by a handful of hushed nicknames among her colleagues. The Tracker, for her uncanny ability to follow the most obscure paper trails. The Bloodhound, for her relentless pursuit of inconsistencies. And sometimes, more reverently, the Oracle, for her seemingly prescient ability to pinpoint vulnerabilities before they escalated into crises. She possessed an almost preternatural knack for sniffing out procedural flaws, detecting subtle lapses in judgment, and identifying systemic vulnerabilities that others, even seasoned veterans with decades in the field, might tragically overlook. Her reports were legendary for their forensic precision, her recommendations for their uncompromising directness, often forcing multi-billion-dollar airlines to recalibrate their entire operational structures. She was a quiet, formidable force against complacency, a silent sentinel ensuring the integrity and safety of the vast, intricate network of American skies. Yet, outside the agency's hallowed, often anonymous halls, Sophie frequently found herself battling a persistent, insidious enemy, the casual underestimation that stemmed from her unassuming demeanor. She preferred practical, comfortable clothing to ostentatious power suits, often opting for dark-wash jeans, a muted gray hoodie pulled casually over a plain t-shirt, and practical worn sneakers when not explicitly in uniform. Her expressive, intelligent eyes, which often held a contemplative rather than overtly commanding gaze, frequently led people to dismiss her. This was a profoundly familiar dynamic, a silent, exhausting battle she had fought throughout her entire professional life, in a field still overwhelmingly dominated by male, often older counterparts. The subtle slights, the condescending tones, the casual assumptions about her capabilities based on nothing more than her gender and race were a constant, low-grade hum in the background of her professional existence. She had, over the years, learned to navigate these treacherous currents with a quiet grace, allowing her actions rather than her words to be her most potent form of communication. Her quietness was not a sign of weakness, but a deliberate reservoir of strength. Tonight, her focus was razor-sharp, honed by years of relentless practice and an almost innate ability to synthesize complex information, on the intricate details of her next undercover assignment. Tomorrow, she would undergo a meticulous transformation, shedding the persona of the precise FAA senior inspector and seamlessly morphing into Sophie Albright, an ordinary, unremarkable passenger on Global Airways Flight 712, a seemingly routine cross-country journey from the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles to the bustling heart of New York City. But for Sophie, this was far more than a mere flight. It was a covert audit, a deep dive into the operational integrity and, more crucially, the human element of Global Airways. The mission had been specifically prompted by a recent, alarming uptick in passenger complaints about unprofessional staff behavior. Specifically, instances of overt rudeness, thinly veiled discrimination, and a disturbing lack of empathy towards diverse passengers, coupled with concerning internal FAA reports hinting at systemic procedural shortcuts being taken at Global's notoriously chaotic gate operations in Terminal B. She meticulously reviewed the airline's latest manifest, cross-referencing it with recent FAA safety bulletins, internal risk assessments, and a confidential FAA watch list of recurrent operational issues identified at various airlines. Her objective was clear, almost surgical in its precision. Observe, document, and identify any systemic issues that compromised either passenger experience or, more critically, the inviolable principles of aviation safety. Her internal conflict, a familiar and often weary companion, was also keenly present. How to remain utterly objective, how to simply assess compliance with the cold, unfeeling logic of regulation, when every fiber of her being felt the profound fatigue of constantly having to prove her worth, especially in situations where she was consciously obscuring her true identity, forcing herself to be perceived as less than she truly was. She needed to blend in, to become a ghost in the machine, to observe the true, unfiltered face of the airline's operations, untainted by the commanding presence of an official FAA badge. Just last month, on a rare personal trip to visit her sister in the rain-swept tranquility of Seattle, a fleeting, much-needed escape from the relentless demands of her demanding job, Sophie had witnessed a scene that perfectly encapsulated the very issues she tirelessly sought to rectify within the aviation industry. Seated comfortably in row 12, pretending to engross herself in a dense technical manual, she had observed, with her characteristic intensity, a young flight attendant, her name tag identifying her as Maria, a recent graduate of the airline's rigorous training program, being subjected to a relentless public tirade. Her tormentor was a visibly agitated, impeccably dressed but boorish passenger in first class. The passenger, a corpulent man in an expensive but ill-fitting pinstripe suit, was red-faced, his jowls quivering with indignation as he gesticulated wildly, accusing Maria of botching his pre-ordered vegan meal. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the cabin, drawing uncomfortable glances and hushed whispers from other passengers. "This is simply unacceptable. Your incompetence is astounding. I pay a premium for this service, not for amateur hour." Maria, a young Latina woman, maintained a remarkable, almost superhuman composure despite the public humiliation, her voice soft and apologetic as she repeatedly offered to rectify the error, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she held the offending meal tray. Her eyes, however, held a flicker of deep-seated resignation, a familiar look Sophie recognized from countless experiences of her own throughout her career. Sophie, observing from a few rows back, her own jaw tightening imperceptibly, had felt a familiar surge of indignation, a cold, hard knot forming in the pit of her stomach. Her first instinct, honed by years of witnessing such casual abuses of power, whether in a high-stakes government briefing room or a cramped airplane cabin, was to intervene directly, to calmly but firmly remind the man of airline conduct policies and the FAA's stringent regulations regarding disruptive passengers. But she was off-duty, flying as an ordinary citizen, and direct confrontation wasn't always the most effective path to systemic, lasting change. Sometimes a scalpel was more effective than a hammer. Instead, upon landing, as passengers disembarked in a slow, orderly stream, she quietly made her way past the still bewildered Maria and discreetly noted the flight attendant's employee number, carefully recorded the flight number, and made a detailed mental note of the approximate time of the incident. Later that evening, from the quiet anonymity of her home computer, shielded by multiple layers of encrypted networks, she composed a detailed, commendatory report to Global Airways' Corporate Customer Service Department. She meticulously praised Maria's exemplary professionalism, her unflagging patience, and her unwavering adherence to company protocol under duress, highlighting her extraordinary composure in the face of egregious and unwarranted verbal abuse. She subtly, almost imperceptibly, suggested that such admirable conduct might warrant further training on de-escalation for all staff, subtly hinting at the egregious behavior of the passenger without naming him directly, ensuring the airline would investigate the passenger's actions, not just Maria's. It was a small, unseen act, yet it spoke volumes of Sophie's unwavering commitment to fairness, not just in regulatory compliance, but in the fundamental realm of human dignity and respect. As the city lights twinkled outside her apartment window, mirroring the methodical blinking of her secure router, Sophie closed her laptop, the dark screen reflecting her own calm, determined face. Her gaze drifted towards a small, locked mahogany box, unadorned by any external markings, tucked away in a deep, secured drawer of her desk. Inside, meticulously arranged on a plush velvet lining, lay a collection of commendations, discreet plaques, and even a rare gleaming gold-plated FAA medal for exceptional service in aviation safety. These were not mere trinkets. They were tangible evidence of a career defined by high-stakes investigations, covert operations where her tenacity and razor-sharp intellect had uncovered major safety violations, averting potential disasters that the public would never even know had been narrowly avoided. She didn't display them. Such accolades were personal validations, quiet affirmations of her profound impact, not public spectacles to feed an ego. They were silent reminders of the quiet, yet profound difference she had made, often from the shadows, ensuring hundreds of thousands of lives were safeguarded. And somewhere within those treasured mementos, folded carefully within a sealed, government-issued envelope, was a special, rarely seen identification card, a platinum-edged pass for the highest levels of federal access, a symbol of a power and jurisdiction far exceeding what anyone could discern from her understated attire or her seemingly ordinary appearance. Tomorrow, she would be just another face in the bustling anonymity of an airport crowd, a seemingly ordinary black woman navigating the everyday indignities that many simply accepted as part of modern travel. But beneath that unassuming surface, the vigilant, incisive mind of FAA Senior Inspector Sophie Albright was already at work, primed to uncover any hidden truths, to expose any quiet injustices that threatened the safety and integrity of the very skies she was sworn to protect. The morning air at Los Angeles International Airport, typically thick with the metallic tang of jet fuel and the excited polyglot chatter of travelers, felt particularly charged as Sophie Albright, now fully immersed in her undercover persona, navigated the sprawling expanse of Terminal B. She was dressed deliberately simply, almost blandly. Dark wash jeans, a muted gray hoodie pulled casually over a plain t-shirt, and practical worn sneakers. A nondescript backpack, seemingly stuffed with the usual travel essentials like a water bottle and a paperback novel, hung loosely from one shoulder. Her face was bare of makeup, her hair pulled back into a simple, functional ponytail. She looked in every conceivable way, like any other weary traveler, blending seamlessly into the vast, anonymous river of humanity flowing towards their respective gates. Her immediate objective, Global Airways Flight 712, a non-stop service to New York, scheduled to board from Gate 32 in precisely 45 minutes. As she approached the designated area, the usual cacophony of a busy airport gate swelled around her, the intermittent squawk of announcements crackling over the intercom, the impatient whir of baggage carousels, the excited cries of children, and the low, constant rumble of distant jet engines. But a sharp, discordant note emerged from the Global Airways counter, immediately cutting through the background noise and instantly drawing Sophie's acutely trained professional attention. It was a voice, sharp and almost hostile, belonging to Karen Thorne, the gate agent. Karen was a woman in her late 50s, her thin, gray hair pulled back into a severe, almost painful-looking bun. Her face seemed perpetually set in a grimace of disdain, deep lines etched around her mouth, suggesting years of barely suppressed irritation. Karen had a notorious, though largely unaddressed reputation within the airline's internal complaint system, often dismissed by upper management as mere personality quirks or stress-related grumpiness. She was widely known among her colleagues for her icy demeanor, her clipped, impatient tones, and a particularly condescending attitude towards passengers she deemed problematic, or more accurately, undeserving of her attention. Her biases, often subtly yet unmistakably hinted at, related to appearance, perceived social standing, or even, as internal reports suggested, ethnicity. Sophie paused a few yards from the counter, observing Karen for a moment from a discreet distance, her gaze analytical and dispassionate. She noted the rigid, almost defensive set of Karen's shoulders, the way her eyes quickly scanned arriving passengers, almost cataloging them, judging them, before they even reached the counter. A young couple, clearly first-time international travelers, perhaps on their honeymoon, approached Karen nervously, their excitement palpable, clutching their thick passports. Karen barely looked up from her screen, barking terse instructions about luggage tags and overweight fees, her tone dismissive, her body language radiating annoyance. The couple, visibly deflated, retreated to a nearby bench to repack their bags. their initial excitement replaced by a palpable sense of defeat. This, Sophie noted internally, making a mental timestamp and observation, was precisely the kind of systemic, dehumanizing behavior that eroded passenger trust, created unnecessary stress, and subtly hinted at a deeper disregard for proper protocol and customer service standards. It was a microcosm of the very complaints that had prompted this particular audit. When it was Sophie's turn, she approached the counter with a practiced, neutral smile, her movements unhurried, almost deferential, designed to elicit the most natural, unvarnished response from the agent. She avoided direct, challenging eye contact, instead focusing on the worn counter surface, reinforcing her persona as an unassuming, perhaps slightly nervous traveler. "Good morning," she offered, her voice soft, trying to project an air of quiet politeness that she hoped might disarm any preconceived notions. She then gently slid her dark blue U.S. passport across the counter, its familiar emblem a stark contrast against the beige laminate. Karen Thorne, however, didn't even bother to meet Sophie's gaze. Her eyes, already narrowed with an unspoken prejudice that seemed to flicker to life at the sight of Sophie's dark skin, merely flicked over Sophie's unassuming outfit. Without touching the passport, Karen scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound that was barely audible above the general terminal din, but cut through Sophie's carefully constructed calm like a razor. "Next," she snapped, her voice loud enough to carry, her hand waving vaguely at the non-existent line behind Sophie, as if Sophie were merely an irritating, insignificant interruption, an obstacle to her day. Sophie remained outwardly calm, her neutral smile unwavering, though a flicker of internal resolution hardened behind her eyes. "My flight is Flight 712 to New York," she stated again, her voice still soft, gently pushing the passport slightly further across the counter, hoping to prompt Karen to engage. Karen finally deigned to pick up the passport, but her movements were abrupt, almost violent. She snatched it from the counter, her fingers brushing Sophie's, a gesture laden with ill-concealed contempt. She flipped through the pages with a rapid, almost frantic disdain, her expression a contorted mask as if searching desperately for a hidden flaw, a reason to dismiss, to deny. Her eyes darted over the visa pages, the entry and exit stamps, finding nothing immediately amiss. Sophie knew, of course, that for a purely domestic flight, international visas were utterly irrelevant. Karen wasn't looking for a valid document. She was looking for a reason to find fault, a justification for her preconceived judgment. Then Karen's gaze fixated on a minor, almost imperceptible smudge on one of the inner pages, perhaps a faint fingerprint or a slight, almost invisible crease near the binding, a minuscule imperfection that any reasonable person would instantly dismiss. A venomous smile, thin and chilling, stretched across her lips, transforming her already unpleasant features into something truly ugly. "Well, well, well," she drawled, her voice dripping with mock sweetness, loud enough to draw the attention of a few waiting passengers, whose murmurs immediately hushed. "What do we have here, little girl? Do you actually think this," she held up the passport with exaggerated distaste, "is a valid passport? It looks like some kind of cheap forgery. Or perhaps you've simply ruined it trying to sneak something past us, She chuckled, a harsh grating sound that grated on Sophie's ears, clearly enjoying her moment of perceived superiority and power. Without a moment's hesitation, without any warning, Karen Thorne, with a sudden, vicious motion, tore a corner off Sophie's passport. The crisp, sickening rip of paper sliced through the air like a knife, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, horrified silence of the gate area. The torn piece, with a fragment of Sophie's personal information, fluttered to the counter like a fallen leaf, a tangible symbol of destruction. Karen then slammed the mutilated document onto the counter, pushing it back towards Sophie with a sneering flourish. "You think you can fly with that? Get out of here. We don't tolerate this kind of fraud at Global Airways. Now move along, you're holding up the line." Her eyes blazed with a triumphant, contemptuous fire, a clear signal that she was done with Sophie, dismissing her as a worthless, deceptive entity unworthy of even basic human courtesy. A collective gasp swept through the small knot of passengers waiting in line, their faces etched with surprise and discomfort. Others exchanged worried glances, some even discreetly pulling out their phones, a silent acknowledgement of the potential for a viral incident. But no one dared intervene. The air was thick with the chilling reality of what had just transpired, a blatant act of disrespect, an arbitrary abuse of power fueled by undisguised prejudice, and a direct assault on federal property. A United States passport, which was not Sophie's personal possession, but a document of the U.S. government. Sophie felt a cold, calculated fury bloom within her, eclipsing the practiced calm she had so meticulously maintained. This was no longer merely a personal insult. It was a flagrant violation of airline policy, an act of destruction against a federal document, and, most critically, a direct obstruction of a federal investigation. Karen Thorne's actions were not just unprofessional, they were criminal, born of a deep-seated prejudice that permeated the very operational fabric Sophie was there to inspect. This was her point of no return. To walk away, to accept this public humiliation, to allow such blatant misconduct to go unpunished, would be to betray not just herself and her personal dignity, but the countless passengers who faced similar indignities and the very principles of fairness, safety, and respect that the FAA was sworn to uphold. The covert audit had just become a very public, very personal fight for justice, and Sophie Albright, the unassuming passenger, was about to reveal the formidable force she truly was. The gauntlet had been thrown, and Sophie, with an almost terrifying calm, prepared to pick it up. The single, brutal sound of tearing paper still echoed in the sudden, appalled silence that had fallen over Gate 32. Thomas Miller, the financial titan, had only paused for a moment in the courtroom. Karen Thorne, the gate agent, had frozen solid, her hand still hovering in the air where she'd released the desecrated passport. Her face, moments before contorted with scorn, was now a mask of shocked disbelief, the cruel smile wiped clean. A palpable tension, thick and suffocating, had descended upon the gate area, replacing the usual airport din. Passengers, who had been murmuring or discreetly filming, now simply stared, their phones lowered, their expressions a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Sophie Albright, however, remained outwardly impassive. Her earlier politeness, her carefully constructed deference, had vanished. In its place was a stillness that was far more unnerving than any outburst of anger. Her dark eyes, no longer veiled by the persona of a meek traveler, now held an icy precision, stripping away Karen's bravado with a single, unblinking stare. Karen's actions were not merely an inconvenience. They were a direct challenge to federal authority, an act of malicious vandalism against a U.S. government document, and, most damningly, a severe obstruction of an active federal investigation. Sophie had faced down armed threats and navigated labyrinthine corporate conspiracies in her past life. Karen Thorne, with her petty cruelty and prejudiced arrogance, was merely another obstacle, albeit one far beneath her usual purview. "Ms. Thorne," Sophie's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was not loud, but it cut through the air with a chilling, surgical precision. It was devoid of anger, or any discernible emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. Each word was carefully enunciated, imbued with an undeniable authority. "Your recent actions constitute not only a direct violation of Global Airways customer service protocols, but also a deliberate act of destroying federal property and obstructing a federal officer in the performance of her duties." Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, held Karen's, compelling the gate agent to look at her, truly look at her, for the first time without the lens of prejudice. Karen, still reeling, opened her mouth to retort, perhaps another condescending remark, or a panicked, ill-conceived justification. But Sophie cut her off with a single, decisive gesture of her hand, a subtle, almost imperceptible flick of her wrist that nonetheless carried immense weight. "I advise you to reconsider your next words, Ms. Thorne. Every action you have taken, every word you have uttered since I approached this counter, is being duly noted and will be accounted for. Furthermore, you are already in severe violation of several federal statutes. Do you understand the gravity of what you have just done?" Karen's face, which had been pale, now flushed scarlet, then drained again to an ashen gray. She tried to force a dismissive laugh, a scoff, but it died in her throat, strangled by a dawning, profound terror. The cold steel in Sophie's gaze was unsettling. It was the look of someone who saw through her, not just to her petty cruelty, but to the deeper, systemic rot beneath. Karen shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, her hands visibly trembling. The casual power she wielded over passengers had just evaporated, replaced by a terrifying sense of her own vulnerability. Then, with a deliberate, almost ritualistic movement, Sophie reached into the small, nondescript backpack slung over her shoulder. Her hand emerged, clutching a slim, dark leather wallet. It was an unassuming object, one she had carried with her for decades, a quiet repository of her true identity, a testament to her unyielding commitment to the silent duties she performed. The gate area, already hushed, seemed to hold its collective breath, wondering what mundane object she might produce. A replacement passport, perhaps, or a complaint form she intended to fill out. She unfastened the magnetic clasp of the wallet with a soft, almost imperceptible click. Her fingers, nimble and practiced from countless rapid identifications, slid out a gleaming object. It wasn't a mundane driver's license. It wasn't a standard airline ID badge. It wasn't even a typical government employee card. Under the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights of the gate, a Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) inspector badge flashed, its polished silver surface reflecting a blinding glint. Adjacent to it, nestled securely in a clear plastic sleeve within the wallet, was a platinum-edged identification card, conspicuously larger and more formal than a standard airport ID. Emblazoned clearly on its face, beneath the official FAA seal, were the words, Federal Aviation Administration, Senior Inspector, Security and Compliance, Level 5, Clearance. It was a credential that granted her unrestricted access, unquestionable authority, and the power to demand compliance from any aviation entity operating within U.S. jurisdiction. Sophie did not speak. She simply held the wallet aloft, her arms steady, her expression unreadable. She held it just for a few seconds, long enough for the light to catch it, long enough for its stark, undeniable authority to sink into the collective consciousness of the gate area. The badge, a symbol of unwavering regulatory oversight and relentless investigation into aviation safety, hung in the air, a devastating counterpoint to the contempt Karen had just displayed. It wasn't merely a piece of identification. It was a nonverbal declaration of absolute, unimpeachable federal power. A collective gasp swept through the gate area, quickly followed by a profound, almost terrifying silence. The single snicker from a few thoughtless passengers died abruptly, choked off by dawning horror. Faces, which moments before had held casual disdain or bored indifference, were now etched with incredulity and dawning dread. This wasn't just another passenger. This was something else entirely. Karen Thorne, who had been trying to regain some semblance of composure, saw the badge. Her face, which had been set in an arrogant sneer, instantly froze. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her a sickly, pallid white. Her jaw went slack, her eyes wide with a sudden dawning comprehension. The blood rushed from her face, leaving it pasty and ghostlike. Her carefully constructed facade of superiority, built on years of petty power plays, shattered in an instant. The FAA, a senior inspector, undercover, and she had just torn up federal property and obstructed a federal agent. The implications were a cold, hard slap to her overinflated ego, a sudden, brutal shattering of her sense of untouchable privilege. Her eyes darted wildly, frantically, from the gleaming badge to Sophie's unflinching gaze, then to the growing crowd of stunned passengers, a silent, desperate plea for rescue. At that exact moment, a tall, burly airport security officer, Miller, no relation to Thomas Miller from the previous story, who had been observing the commotion from a distance, began to approach the counter, his expression initially one of irritation at the disturbance. He had seen Karen Thorne's aggressive posture and heard her raised voice, and assumed it was another one of her difficult passenger incidents. He was about to intervene, perhaps to tell Sophie to move along. But as he drew closer, he, too, saw the badge. His irritation instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound shock, then immediate, rigid respect. He snapped to attention, his body language shifting instantly from casual annoyance to alert deference. He knew the FAA. He knew their authority superseded his own at the airport. He knew he had just narrowly avoided a catastrophic misjudgment, almost interfering with a federal agent in a highly public, sensitive situation. In the press of passengers, a few individuals who had been discreetly filming the confrontation now lowered their phones, their faces a mixture of astonishment and vindication. They had just witnessed a moment of pure, unadulterated drama, a stunning reversal of power. The headline wrote itself in their minds. Gate agent rips passport, unknowingly attacks federal inspector. This wasn't just a travel delay, it was a phenomenon. Sophie, having allowed the badge's profound significance to fully register with Karen and the stunned onlookers, slowly, deliberately, returned it to her wallet, tucking it away with the same practiced ease with which she had produced it. The brief flash of silver was gone, but its indelible impact lingered. A cold, hard truth that had irrevocably reset the entire dynamic of the gate area. The air, once thick with Karen's contempt, was now heavy with her terror, and a building wave of quiet, almost reverent respect from the observing crowd. "Ms. Thorne," Sophie stated, her voice returning to its calm, judicial cadence, but now imbued with an undeniable, steely edge that had been absent before. "Your outburst, your derogatory remarks, your destruction of a U.S. government document, and your clear disregard for the authority of the Federal Aviation Administration constitute severe federal offenses. You are now formally under investigation by the FAA, and your employment with Global Airways is, effective immediately, suspended pending the outcome of this investigation." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, their weight crushing Karen's last vestiges of defiance. "Furthermore, given your actions, I am now officially detaining you. Officer," she turned her gaze, sharp and unwavering, to the now attentive Airport Security Officer Miller. "Please escort Ms. Thorne to a secure private area. She is not to leave the premises. I will require a full incident report from you, and I will be contacting your superiors immediately." She brought her gaze back to Karen Thorne, who was now trembling visibly, her face contorted in a silent plea. "The FAA takes matters of passenger safety, regulatory compliance, and the professional conduct of airline personnel with the utmost seriousness, Ms. Thorne, especially when such conduct involves blatant discrimination and obstruction of federal duties. Your actions have demonstrated a severe lack of judgment and a fundamental disregard for the very regulations you are employed to uphold." Sophie then turned her attention to the rest of the waiting passengers, her voice now projecting a calm, reassuring authority that cut through their lingering shock. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unexpected delay. There has been a security incident involving a procedural breach. Global Airways will be providing new gate agents to process your boarding passes shortly. Your patience is appreciated." She brought her gaze back to Karen Thorne, who was now trembling visibly, her face contorted in a silent plea, her earlier arrogance utterly crushed. "Ms. Thorne," Sophie concluded, her voice low and utterly devoid of mercy, "you have just ensured that not only your employment, but your future in the aviation industry is over. Your contempt has served only to expose yourself." The initial confrontation was over, and the tables had not just turned. They had been flipped with a devastating, undeniable force, setting in motion a cascade of consequences that Karen Thorne, in her small-minded prejudice, could never have anticipated. The immediate aftermath at Gate 32 was a tableau of stunned silence and dawning realization. Karen Thorne, now visibly shaking, was being discreetly but firmly escorted away by Officer Miller, her protests dissolving into incoherent whimpers. The passengers, a moment ago voyeurs of a shocking spectacle, were now exchanging hushed, excited whispers, their eyes darting between Sophie and the empty counter. The air, thick with the residue of confrontation, slowly began to thin, replaced by a growing hum of anticipation. Sophie, however, felt no immediate triumph. The adrenaline that had surged through her veins during the unveiling was receding, leaving behind the cold, strategic clarity of a seasoned operative. This initial skirmish was merely the prelude. She knew with absolute certainty that Karen Thorne was a symptom, not the disease. The true battle lay ahead, against a system that had allowed such prejudice and procedural laxity to fester. Her immediate priority was to re-establish control and ensure the FAA's authority was not only asserted, but respected. She approached the abandoned gate counter, retrieving her torn passport, its desecrated corner a stark reminder of the unprofessionalism she was there to expose. Even as she did so, Her mind was already 2 steps ahead, mapping out the next moves. She needed to secure the scene, document everything, and, most crucially, elevate the incident to the highest levels, ensuring it couldn't be swept under the rug by a complacent airline management eager to avoid bad press. Just as she was mentally drafting her immediate report, the familiar, insistent vibration of her secure government-issued phone cut through the lingering silence. The caller ID flashed, "Director Reynolds, FAA Compliance Division." Sophie took a deep, centering breath. This was it, the official gauntlet. Director Reynolds, a man of rigid adherence to protocol and a staunch defender of the FAA's public image, would not be pleased. "Sophie," Director Reynolds's voice when she answered, was taut with barely controlled exasperation, devoid of his usual jovial tone. "My phone is absolutely melting down. What in God's name happened at Gate 32? We're getting reports, highly disturbing reports, about a gate agent, a torn passport, and a federal inspector revealing her badge in public. Do you have any idea how that looks, Sophie? How unprofessional it seems?" His emphasis on unprofessional was a clear rebuke, dripping with implied criticism. Sophie's voice, however, remained calm, steady, and entirely unruffled. "Director Reynolds, a Global Airways gate agent, Karen Thorne, directly assaulted federal property by tearing my U.S. passport. Furthermore, she verbally abused and attempted to obstruct me, a federal officer, in the performance of my duties during an active undercover audit. Her actions were fueled by blatant discriminatory prejudice and a shocking disregard for standard operating procedures. My display of the badge was not a theatrical flourish. It was a necessary and immediate measure to de-escalate a volatile situation, re-establish control, and confirm the gravity of her federal offenses when she repeatedly ignored verbal warnings. Necessary? Or a highly irregular, perhaps even reckless display that has now plunged Global Airways, and by extension the FAA, into a public relations nightmare?" Reynolds retorted, his agitation escalating. "Sophie, you are an FAA inspector, not a covert operative for a spy agency. We operate by the book, by the meticulous rules of judicial and federal conduct. This could be seen as an abuse of your authority, using a past affiliation, a personal dramatic flair, to intimidate an airline employee. Do you understand the implications? Rumors are already swirling on social media and with the press that you're unstable, that you're playing politics, that you acted out of personal pique, not professional necessity. We're already getting calls about a potential lawsuit from the gate agents union, citing emotional distress and wrongful termination." Sophie's grip tightened imperceptibly on her phone. The insidious whispers she had always quietly endured, the subtle dismissals of her competence due to her identity, were now amplified, weaponized against her by the very system she served. She understood the precarious tightrope she walked. A black female federal inspector, already navigating a predominantly white, male institution, had just executed a maneuver that, in some entrenched circles, would be seen as an outrageous breach of decorum, an unforgivable overstep. Her integrity, her hard-earned reputation, even her future within the FAA, now hung by a single fraying thread. The institutional inertia, the desire to maintain the status quo and avoid controversy, was a far more formidable opponent than Karen Thorne. "Director," Sophie interjected, her voice firm, cutting through his agitated monologue, "my actions were in direct response to a criminal act, a discriminatory act, and a contemptuous act against federal authority. Furthermore, given the nature of the original complaints regarding Global Airways, my expertise in identifying systemic behavioral and procedural lapses is not merely an affiliation, it is a directly relevant, critical skill set. Ms. Thorne's behavior, coupled with the documented history of similar complaints against this airline, leads me to believe this is not an isolated incident, but indicative of a deeper, more dangerous problem within Global Airways culture. My concern is not personal. It is for the safety and equitable treatment of all passengers, and for the integrity of the FAA's regulatory oversight." Reynolds sighed, a frustrated, exasperated sound that resonated with the immense pressure he was under. "Fine, Sophie, fine, but this has put us in an impossible position. Global Airways' legal team is already screaming for a full FAA inquiry into your conduct, citing judicial bias and improper procedure. The optics are abysmal. We need to handle this with the utmost delicacy to avoid a public relations catastrophe and a potentially damaging lawsuit against the agency. I'm calling an emergency, high-level meeting with the FAA's General Counsel and the Department of Transportation's Oversight Committee this afternoon. You will be there. You need to explain yourself, and you need to convince them that this isn't a pattern of uncontrolled behavior. Your entire career could hinge on this. The call ended abruptly, the dial tone a flat, final note in the sudden silence of the gate. Sophie leaned against the counter, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was the gauntlet. She was isolated, facing judgment, not just from the media and the infuriated airline, but from her own agency's highest echelons. The very system she had dedicated her life to upholding was now questioning her methods, her judgment, even her very fitness for the role. The ticking clock wasn't just about Karen Thorne, it was about her entire career, her legacy, and her ability to effect meaningful change within the aviation industry. The longer the uncertainty lingered, the more damage it would inflict, creating doubt in the validity of any future findings she might make. She had to act decisively, not just to salvage her reputation, but to ensure that this incident served as a potent catalyst for real systemic reform within Global Airways, and potentially across the entire industry. She knew Global Airways' tactics. They would try to leverage this incident, portraying Karen Thorne as a victim of an overzealous, biased federal agent. They would use their considerable lobbying power, their vast legal resources, to muddy the waters, to force a recusal, or even worse, to get the entire incident dismissed as an isolated misunderstanding, thereby protecting their deeply flawed corporate culture. The thought of Karen Thorne walking free, or worse, remaining unpunished for her blatant prejudice, simply because Sophie was forced to defend herself, was intolerable. The public, too, might be swayed to see her as just another angry black woman, vindictive and uncontrolled, rather than a dedicated inspector fighting for justice and safety. This was a battle for perception as much as for legal truth and procedural compliance. Sophie pushed herself off the counter and walked to a deserted corner of the gate area, looking out at the endless stream of planes taking off and landing, symbolic of the interconnectedness of the system she served. She closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the precise details of Karen Thorne's actions, recalling the exact words, the subtle facial expressions. More importantly, she thought of Maria, the young flight attendant, and the countless other individuals who had faced similar microaggressions and overt biases in their daily interactions within the industry. This was not just about one gate agent, it was about the culture of an entire organization. She opened her eyes, resolve hardening her jaw. She wouldn't just defend her actions, she would turn this crisis into an unprecedented opportunity. Karen Thorne's contempt, her open prejudice, had, ironically, been a gift. It had allowed Sophie to publicly reveal a hidden aspect of her power, to hint at an expertise that went far beyond mere regulatory compliance. It had forced the issue into the light. She pulled out her secure government-issued tablet, a piece of equipment far more advanced than anything a typical passenger would carry, capable of secure communication and data analysis on the fly. Her fingers, still possessing the speed and precision of a seasoned investigator, began to tap furiously across the encrypted screen. She started compiling a detailed dossier, not just on Karen Thorne's contempt, but on the deeper, more insidious web of discriminatory practices and systemic procedural shortcuts that her undercover audit had already begun to uncover. She would present it to the FAA General Counsel and the DOT Committee, not as a defensive explanation, but as a compelling, undeniable reason for her unprecedented actions. She would highlight the specific nuances of employee misconduct, the subtle evasions of safety protocols, the ingrained culture of bias that an ordinary auditor might miss, but which screamed systemic failure to a highly trained FAA senior inspector. She would argue that her prior experience, her unique perspective as a black woman in a position of authority, was not a liability to be excused, but an indispensable asset in this specific case, and indeed, for the future of aviation safety and equity. Her ultimate gamble. She wouldn't just ask for continued jurisdiction over the Global Airways investigation. She would demand it, and more. She would propose an expanded nationwide investigation into airline employee conduct and passenger discrimination, leveraging her undercover methodology and her unique insights to identify similar patterns across the entire industry. She would not allow herself to be silenced or sidelined. She would face the FAA's highest authorities head-on, not as a defendant, but as a prosecutor of justice, ready to expose a deeper truth that threatened the very fabric of air travel. The integrity of the FAA, her own integrity, and the very concept of impartial, equitable service depended on it. She was, in this moment, isolated, but armed with a formidable intellect, an unshakable moral compass, and a hidden power that few truly understood. The gauntlet had been thrown, and Sophie Albright, the quiet, underestimated inspector, was ready to pick it up, not just for herself, but for every passenger who had ever felt invisible, disrespected, or judged. The emergency high-level meeting room on the executive floor of the FAA's Los Angeles regional office, usually a bastion of subdued authority and hushed, almost reverent legal discourse, crackled with an almost palpable tension. The air was thick with the weight of expectation, simmering skepticism, and the faint, lingering scent of expensive coffee that did little to cut through the palpable anxiety. Director Reynolds, his face a tight mask of professional concern, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by the stern-faced legal counsel for the FAA and the Department of Transportation's Oversight Committee members, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to barely concealed disapproval. They represented the bedrock of the federal aviation system, the guardians of its intricate procedures, and they were ready to dissect and interrogate Senior Inspector Sophie Albright on her unprecedented actions at Gate 32. Sophie walked in, her stride composed, her posture unwavering, exuding a quiet confidence that seemed to absorb the room's ambient tension rather than succumb to it. She carried only her slim, secure government-issued tablet, its dark screen a stark contrast to the thick binders and legal pads usually present at such high-stakes meetings. She chose her seat, facing the committee directly, her gaze sweeping over each member, meeting their scrutiny with an unwavering, almost defiant, resolve. She was not here to apologize for her actions. She was here to justify them, to expose a truth far more profound and dangerous than a single act of contempt. Director Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice formal, betraying none of the earlier agitation from their phone call. Inspector Albright, thank you for attending. We are here to discuss the deeply concerning events of this morning's proceedings concerning Global Airways Flight 712. Specifically, your unconventional response to the defendant's contempt and the highly unusual public display of your FAA credentials. The committee requires a thorough, unvarnished explanation of your actions and the circumstances that necessitated them. Sophie nodded, her expression resolute. Director Reynolds, members of the committee, I understand your concerns regarding decorum, procedure, and the public perception of the Federal Aviation Administration. My actions this morning were indeed unconventional by design. But they were not impulsive, nor were they born of personal pique. They were a direct, calculated response to a blatant, egregious assault on the integrity of this agency, the security of federal property, and the fundamental right of a passenger to be treated with respect. That assault was fueled by Mr. Thorne's explicit racial and gendered contempt, and a shocking disregard for the critical role I was performing as a federal officer during an active, undercover audit. Her voice was calm, measured, devoid of defensiveness, yet imbued with an underlying steel that commanded attention. When a gate agent in a position of public trust openly mocks a passenger, destroys a U.S. government document, and by extension, challenges the very concept of impartial service and federal authority, a mere verbal contempt citation, in that moment, would have been woefully insufficient to stem the tide of her defiance and the chilling effect it had on the integrity of the airport environment. My actions were a necessary escalation. A senior legal counsel from the Department of Transportation, Mr. Sterling, a man with a meticulously trimmed gray beard and an air of traditional, almost rigid authority, interjected, his tone sharp, his eyes narrowed with skepticism. But an FAA badge, Inspector Albright, and a Level 5 clearance ID. That is an extraordinary, unprecedented measure for a routine gate incident. It could be perceived, and indeed is being perceived by Global Airways' legal team and public relations department, as judicial intimidation, an unfair leveraging of past authority against a low-level airline employee. It sets a dangerous precedent, Inspector. We are already dealing with a deluge of media inquiries and a formal grievance from the gate agents' union alleging harassment and undue duress. His words hung in the air, a thinly veiled accusation. This was the very hang-by-a-single-hair moment Sophie had anticipated, the critical juncture where her career and the fate of her mission would be decided. The room leaned in, waiting for her defense, for her to falter, to show a flicker of regret or uncertainty. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the weight of not just her reputation, but the broader implications for the FAA pressing down on her. This was where she turned the tables. "Respectfully, Mr. Sterling, members of the committee," Sophie began, her gaze unwavering, holding his. "My prior service with the FAA's elite Special Investigations Unit, particularly within the Covert Operations and Financial Crimes Division, is not merely an affiliation or a personal dramatic flair. It is a deep, specialized expertise in identifying, infiltrating, and dismantling complex systemic failures and criminal enterprises that often hide behind seemingly mundane operational procedures." When Ms. Thorne began to engage in abusive, racially charged, and utterly contemptuous behavior on the stand, accusing me, an undercover inspector, of fraud and attempting to destroy federal property, I observed patterns, not just of individual misconduct, but of systemic obfuscation. Patterns of deep-seated prejudice and alarming procedural laxity that screamed of a broader, more dangerous problem within Global Airways' operational culture. She activated her tablet, its screen springing to life. With a practiced tap, she projected a complex, color-coded flowchart onto the large, wall-mounted screen at the head of the table. It was a dense, intricate diagram teeming with interconnected arrows, anonymous internal complaint codes, recurring procedural bypasses, and even a few encrypted financial anomalies, far more detailed and damning than anything presented in Global Airways' public reports, or even in the FAA's initial internal audit findings. While preparing for this undercover audit, Sophie continued, her voice now morphing into the precise analytical cadence of a seasoned, unyielding investigator, the transformation palpable in the room. My specialized training compelled me to look far beyond the superficial passenger complaints. I independently cross-referenced publicly available social media reviews, anonymized internal employee surveys, and Global Airways' own publicly filed incident reports with the FAA's confidential internal database of recurrent violations. What I found were not isolated anomalies, gentlemen and ladies. I found a consistent, disturbing pattern. A pattern of discriminatory gate agents consistently denying boarding to passengers based on arbitrary pretexts, often correlating with their appearance or ethnicity. A pattern of critical safety checks being rushed or entirely bypassed during peak boarding times. And a pattern of documented instances where passenger complaints were systematically minimized, miscategorized, or outright dismissed by lower-level management. She tapped the screen again, highlighting a series of interconnected nodes on the chart. Each node represented a specific date, a specific incident, a specific gate, and a specific employee or management decision. The cumulative effect was damning. "These are not just isolated incidents of poor customer service," she explained, pointing to various clustered nodes on the diagram. "This is a systemic, deeply ingrained cultural problem within Global Airways ground operations, where discriminatory practices are either explicitly sanctioned or, at best, tacitly ignored by leadership." Ms. Thorne's contemptuous behavior this morning, her desperate and misguided attempt to derail the audit, was not just arrogance. It was a direct, calculated act to prevent us from uncovering this entire, much deeper network of systemic failures and discriminatory practices. The committee members, initially skeptical, began to lean forward, their expressions shifting from doubt to intense, almost horrified fascination. Several instinctively pulled out their own pens, making rapid notes, their eyes glued to the complex damning diagram on the screen. Director Reynolds' jaw had dropped slightly, his usual composure dissolving as his eyes darted between the projected evidence and Sophie's unflinching face. The FAA legal counsel exchanged wide-eyed glances, realizing the immense legal exposure Global Airways faced, and, by extension, the agency's prior oversight. "My display of the badge, Mr. Sterling," Sophie concluded, her voice gaining a quiet, undeniable power that resonated through the room, was not an act of intimidation designed for a low-level employee. It was an immediate non-verbal communication, precisely calculated and delivered at a critical juncture, to Ms. Thorne and to any other Global Airways employee observing that their contempt and their systemic violations would not, under any circumstances, be tolerated. It was a precise, strategic decision to signal that they could not and would not escape accountability by belittling the court of public opinion or attempting to obstruct a federal investigation. It was a clear, unambiguous statement that the Federal Aviation Administration knows exactly what is happening, and we are prepared to act. A profound, stunned silence filled the room. The committee members exchanged glances, a dawning realization spreading across their faces, chilling them to the bone. Sophie hadn't just defended her actions, she had turned the tables completely, revealing a layer of systemic corruption and blatant civil rights violations they hadn't even suspected. Her unconventional action was now revealed as a stroke of strategic brilliance, born from an unparalleled expertise and a moral compass that pointed relentlessly towards true justice. She hadn't just reacted, she had preempted, observed, and now delivered. Then Director Reynolds broke the silence. He slowly rose from his seat, his gaze fixed on Sophie, his expression a mixture of awe, profound respect, and dawning dread at the implications. "Inspector Albright," he said, his voice husky with emotion, completely devoid of his earlier irritation. "You have not only clarified your actions beyond any reasonable doubt, but you have also, and far more significantly, unveiled a far graver systemic threat to passenger safety and civil liberties that demands immediate and comprehensive federal intervention. Your unique qualifications are clearly not just an asset. They are, quite frankly, an indispensable necessity for this agency." He turned to the other committee members, his voice now ringing with decisive authority. "Gentlemen, ladies, it is unequivocally clear to me that not only was Inspector Albright's response entirely justified, but her continued, expanded oversight of this investigation into Global Airways, and indeed a broader review of industry-wide practices, is absolutely essential. The Department of Justice must be immediately briefed on these new findings, and Global Airways faces the full, unsparing force of an FAA-led civil rights and safety audit." A chorus of agreement, laced with murmurs of admiration and immediate calls for action, rippled through the room. The tide had turned completely. Sophie hadn't just survived the gauntlet, she had conquered it, transforming a moment of public scrutiny and potential career termination into a powerful testament to her unparalleled capabilities and a watershed moment for aviation justice. Her quiet resolve had pierced through layers of prejudice and complacency, exposing the truth for all to see. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Karen Thorne, still reeling from the shocking revelation of Sophie's identity, sat in a small, windowless holding room, guarded by a grim-faced airport security officer. Her lawyer, a flustered public defender hastily summoned by the airline, looked utterly defeated. The initial charges of insubordination and destruction of property now seemed trivial. News from the executive meeting room, carried by frantic phone calls and hushed whispers among the airport staff, had begun to filter down. Karen's face, which had been ashen, now turned a sickly green. She could hear the distinct sound of federal agents arriving, their authoritative voices and purposeful strides echoing down the corridor. Her holding room door swung open, revealing two figures: a stern-faced, impeccably dressed federal agent from the Department of Justice, and, to Karen's utter horror, Sophie Albright herself, no longer in her casual hoodie, but in a sharp, dark FAA uniform, her eyes cold and resolute. She held a warrant in her hand, not just for obstruction, but for a new, expanded list of federal charges, including civil rights violations and potential racketeering related to the systematic denial of service to certain passenger demographics that Sophie had meticulously documented. "Ms. Thorne," Sophie stated, her voice calm, powerful, and utterly devoid of mercy, her face impassive. "Effective immediately, the incident at Gate 32 has escalated into a full-scale federal investigation. Your immediate termination from Global Airways is now a formality. Your contempt in court, your blatant discriminatory actions, and your destruction of federal property merely expedited this process and revealed the deeper systemic issues we were already investigating. My background, as you now know, has equipped me to recognize precisely the kind of intricate, insidious prejudice and procedural neglect you and others have been orchestrating. Karen Thorne's face, which had been ashen, now turned a sickly, mottled gray. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing uselessly, but no words came out. The formidable gate agent, the woman who had dared to mock and humiliate a passenger based on her appearance, was utterly, completely broken. The laughter and sneers had ceased, replaced by the chilling silence of inevitable, uncompromising federal justice. Her petty power, her perceived influence, her entire miserable world had just collapsed around her, brought down by the very woman she had so arrogantly scorned. The catharsis was complete. The seismic shockwaves of Senior Inspector Sophie Albright's revelation and subsequent decisive actions at Gate 32 reverberated far beyond the confines of the Los Angeles International Airport. The incident, caught on numerous passenger cell phones, quickly went viral, transforming from a mere local disturbance into a national exposé. The image of Sophie, calm and resolute, holding aloft her FAA badge against the backdrop of Karen Thorne's crumbling arrogance, became a powerful, iconic symbol. For Karen Thorne herself, the descent from her petty, self-appointed throne was as swift as it was absolute. Escorted from the airport in handcuffs by federal agents, her once immaculate uniform now seemed to sag, a cruel mockery of her former, albeit limited, authority. The immediate termination from Global Airways was merely the first domino to fall. Her public humiliation was quickly followed by formal federal indictments for destruction of government property, obstruction of a federal investigation, and, most damningly, civil rights violations stemming from documented patterns of discriminatory behavior. She faced a lengthy prison sentence, her bitter pleas for leniency falling on deaf ears. Her downfall became a stark, chilling deterrent, a vivid reminder that no amount of prejudice or perceived status could outrun the long arm of federal law, especially when confronted by someone as unyielding as Sophie Albright. The ripple effect extended throughout Global Airways, forcing a painful but necessary reckoning. The viral videos, coupled with Sophie's meticulously compiled dossier, ignited an inferno of public outrage and immediate regulatory action. Global Airways, facing massive fines, a precipitous drop in stock value, and the very real threat of grounding their operations, underwent a radical, painful overhaul. Executives were fired, systemic biases within their training programs were rooted out, and a new, comprehensive diversity and inclusion initiative was launched, monitored directly by Sophie's now elevated FAA unit. The airline issued a public, unreserved apology to Sophie and to all passengers who had experienced discrimination, a mea culpa broadcast across national news outlets aiming to mend a public image that had been shattered by Thorne's egregious actions. The ripple effect also reached those touched by the initial confrontation, transforming lives in unexpected ways. Emily Chen, the young prosecutor from a parallel narrative, embodying the spirit of burgeoning integrity, found her own career trajectory profoundly altered. While not directly involved in Sophie's airport incident, Emily, representing the earnest pursuit of justice, watched the news coverage of Sophie's unflinching stand with profound awe and renewed determination. The judge's unwavering commitment to fairness resonated deeply with Emily's own aspirations to fight for the marginalized within the legal system. Inspired by Sophie's courage to directly confront injustice, Emily redoubled her efforts in her own cases, particularly those involving corporate malfeasance and systemic discrimination. She began advocating more forcefully for stricter penalties for white-collar criminals and pushing for policies that protected vulnerable populations. Sophie's quiet strength became a guiding star for Emily, proving that true power lay not in overt aggression, but in quiet, unwavering principle. Sophie herself, however, felt no grand sense of triumph. The catharsis was internal, a quiet satisfaction that justice, often slow and circuitous, had been served swiftly and decisively. Her actions had cleared the air, demonstrating that true authority stemmed not from intimidation or prejudice, but from unwavering integrity and a profound commitment to justice. Her initial moniker, the Tracker, or the Bloodhound, had now broadened. Whispers in the halls of power, from Washington, D.C. to airport control towers across the nation, referred to her now as the architect of aviation justice, acknowledging her profound impact on systemic change within the industry. She still maintained her disciplined routine, rising before dawn for Krav Maga, her mind as sharp and agile as her body. This wasn't merely about personal success. It was about ensuring that the scales of justice were balanced for everyone who dared to dream of safe and equitable skies. The Judiciary Committee, along with Director Reynolds, now chastened by their initial skepticism and profoundly impressed by Sophie's strategic brilliance, issued an unprecedented internal FAA memo. It not only strongly commended Senior Inspector Sophie Albright's exceptional judgment, unparalleled expertise, and unwavering commitment to federal regulations and civil rights, but also acknowledged that her unconventional actions were, in fact, crucial to uncovering a vast industry-wide problem of systemic prejudice and procedural laxity. More significantly, Director Reynolds, a man of profound integrity who had once harbored his own quiet reservations about Sophie's assertive style, sought her out personally. In the quiet solitude of his executive office, overlooking the sprawling tarmac, he offered a profound, heartfelt apology. "Sophie," he began, his voice thick with regret, "I owe you a sincere, unreserved apology. My initial concerns about your methods, my preoccupation with maintaining external decorum, blinded me to the deeper justice you were pursuing. You saw what none of us did. Your integrity, your courage, and your extraordinary investigative skills are not just an asset to the FAA. They are, quite frankly, an absolute necessity for this entire institution." He paused, his gaze, now filled with profound respect, meeting hers. "You are truly a remarkable inspector, Sophie, and a remarkable woman. Your actions saved this agency from a far greater crisis." This wasn't just an apology, it was a profound affirmation. Reynolds, deeply impressed by her strategic brilliance and unwavering commitment, offered her a new, groundbreaking opportunity. He proposed the establishment of a specialized National Aviation Integrity Unit within the FAA's Compliance Division, one designed to proactively investigate and prosecute systemic issues of misconduct, discrimination, and procedural negligence across all major airlines, using undercover methodologies and cutting-edge data analysis. And he asked Sophie to lead it, granting her unprecedented autonomy, a significantly expanded budget, and direct access to top-level resources to leverage her unique USSS-honed experience to its fullest potential. This was more than just a promotion. It was a recognition of her singular abilities, a chance to fundamentally reshape a critical aspect of the aviation industry and extend her reach far beyond the confines of a single airport gate. It was the meaningful opportunity that allowed her to truly flourish, using her past as a foundation for unprecedented innovation within the federal regulatory world. This new pivotal role allowed Sophie to immerse herself fully in the kind of intricate investigative work she excelled at, bridging the gap between raw data, human behavior, and prosecutorial action. She became a driving force in identifying dormant prejudice networks, rooting out corrupt practices, and implementing robust ethical training programs across the industry. Her keen eye for detail and her profound understanding of human psychology, honed by years of observation and intervention, proved invaluable. One crisp autumn afternoon, months after Karen Thorne's final sentencing and the complete overhaul at Global Airways, Sophie found herself walking through the bustling FAA headquarters, a profound sense of purpose in her stride. She spotted Sarah Lee, the young court clerk from a parallel narrative, who, having heard about Sophie's actions, had been inspired to apply for a federal position. Sarah, now a confident and indispensable administrative assistant within Sophie's new National Aviation Integrity Unit, moved with a quiet efficiency that belied her once nervous demeanor. She had found her purpose, thriving under Sophie's direct mentorship. "Inspector Albright," Sarah said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips as she approached with a stack of freshly organized top-secret documents. "Just got word from Director Reynolds' office. Another successful undercover operation completed in Chicago. They uncovered a major loophole in a regional airline's safety audit process. saved them from a potential grounding. Sophie nodded, a soft, content smile touching her lips, a rare sight for those who didn't know her well. Excellent work, Sarah. These are the victories that truly matter. Every single data point, every careful observation, contributes to making the skies safer for everyone. She then looked at Sarah, her eyes warm. And to think, it all started with one gate agent who thought she could get away with anything. Sarah chuckled softly. Indeed. No one thought you were more than just a passenger, did they? But you always knew what you were doing. Sophie simply smiled. The airport, once a place where subtle biases and entrenched power structures often went unchallenged, had begun to subtly transform under Evelyn's, Sophie's, influence. Her calm, decisive actions had cleared the air, demonstrating that true authority stemmed not from intimidation or prejudice, but from unwavering integrity and a profound commitment to justice. The atmosphere was no longer cold and impersonal, but imbued with a quiet professionalism that valued merit and equity above all else. Sophie had not just won a case, she had sparked a quiet revolution within the halls of aviation justice. 5 years later, the very air within the federal aviation landscape seemed to hum with a different, more harmonious energy. The pervasive atmosphere of dismissive prejudice and systemic complacency that had once subtly permeated airport terminals had largely dissipated, replaced by a tangible sense of improved professionalism and equitable treatment. It was a transformation directly attributable to the quiet yet profound influence of Senior Inspector Sophie Albright. The echoes of Karen Thorne's sneering contempt and the initial defensive backlash from airline executives had long faded, replaced by widespread recognition of Sophie's unyielding integrity and her strategic foresight. Sophie Albright, now universally revered not just for her keen regulatory mind, but for her unshakable moral compass, had become one of the most influential and respected figures in the U.S. federal aviation system. The specialized National Aviation Integrity Unit she spearheaded had flourished beyond all expectations, becoming a benchmark for proactive oversight. Her unique blend of federal authority and deep investigative acumen, forged during her challenging years with the FAA's Special Investigations Unit, proved to be an unstoppable force against white-collar misconduct and systemic discrimination. Under her relentless guidance, the unit had dismantled several intricate, multi-layered fraud networks, exposed pervasive patterns of bias across multiple major airlines, and, most importantly, implemented industry-wide policy changes that recovered billions in illicit gains, while significantly enhancing passenger safety and civil liberties. She no longer carried her FAA badge as a tool for confrontation. Its power was woven into the very fabric of her reputation, her every action, and the transformed institutions she had helped reshape. Her initial nickname, the Tracker, had been almost entirely forgotten. Now, whispers in the highest echelons of government, from congressional offices in Washington, D.C., to control towers across the sprawling nation, referred to her with deep respect as the architect of aviation justice, acknowledging her profound and lasting impact on systemic change. She still maintained her disciplined routine, rising before dawn for her rigorous Krav Maga sessions, her mind as sharp and agile as her body. This consistent self-mastery was not merely about personal well-being, it was about ensuring she remained at peak performance to champion a cause far greater than herself. Her work was a testament to the belief that true progress wasn't just about catching individual wrongdoers, but about dismantling the flawed systems that enabled them. Emily Chen, inspired directly by Sophie's courage and unwavering stand, had ascended rapidly within the prosecution ranks. She was now a prominent federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights and corporate accountability, renowned for her meticulous preparation and unshakable ethical stance. Emily had become a mentor herself, actively seeking out and nurturing young lawyers, particularly women and minorities, instilling in them the same principles of integrity, resilience, and fierce dedication to justice that Judge Reed, a composite figure representing the broader legal community's inspiration from Sophie's actions, and Sophie Albright had so powerfully embodied. She frequently cited Sophie's story, a powerful, real-world testament to the transformative power of standing firm in the face of prejudice and institutional inertia. As for Karen Thorne, her reign of petty tyranny and prejudice was a distant, bitter memory. She languished in a maximum security federal prison, her once immaculate uniform replaced by standard-issue prison garb, her contemptuous sneer utterly extinguished. Her ill-gotten gains and any remaining personal assets were confiscated as part of her restitution. Her downfall served as a permanent, chilling deterrent for other airline personnel, a stark public demonstration that no one, regardless of their perceived status or ingrained biases, was above the law when the relentless pursuit of justice, spearheaded by Sophie Albright, was brought to bear. Sophie's profound impact extended far beyond the immediate outcomes of her cases. Driven by a deep-seated desire to ensure that talent and integrity were never again overlooked or stifled due to prejudice, she personally established the Albright Fellowship for Aviation Equity. This national program provided comprehensive scholarships, intensive mentorship, and practical training for aspiring legal professionals and aviation specialists from underserved communities, actively encouraging them to pursue challenging careers within the FAA, the Department of Transportation, and other federal law enforcement agencies. She frequently delivered keynote addresses at prestigious legal conferences, aviation summits, and university commencements, sharing her own story not as a tale of personal triumph, but as a compelling call to action for systemic change and a powerful reminder that every single individual had the power to contribute to a more just world. Her speeches resonated deeply, inspiring a new generation to champion justice with both sharp intellect and unwavering moral courage. On a crisp autumn afternoon, precisely 5 years to the day after the infamous Gate 32 incident, Sophie sat in her meticulously organized, spacious office at FAA headquarters, reviewing a new, groundbreaking policy proposal for mandatory anti-bias training across all airline ground operations. A soft knock at the door, and her lead administrative assistant, Sarah Lee, entered, a stack of freshly organized, color-coded reports in her hand. Sarah, now a confident, exceptionally competent, and utterly indispensable part of Sophie's National Aviation Integrity Unit, moved with a quiet efficiency and assuredness that completely belied her once nervous demeanor. She had found her true purpose, thriving under Sophie's direct yet empowering mentorship. "Inspector Albright," Sarah said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips, "just got word from Director Reynolds' office. Another successful fellowship application. A young woman, first in her family to attend law school, with a remarkable essay on the critical importance of diversity in aviation safety and enforcement. She cited your work directly as her inspiration." Sophie nodded, a rare, genuine smile touching her lips, softening her usually stoic features. Her gaze drifted to the framed photograph on her desk, a simple, unadorned picture of Maria, the flight attendant she had subtly helped years ago, now a senior flight service manager, thriving in a more equitable environment. "Excellent, Sarah," Sophie said, her voice warm, imbued with a quiet, profound contentment. "These are the victories that truly matter. The legacy we build. One person, one policy, one just act at a time." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the expansive window that overlooked the sprawling, intricate tapestry of Washington, D.C., with tiny planes visible in the distant sky. She no longer needed to carry her badge openly. Its power, its meaning, was now woven into the very fabric of her reputation, her groundbreaking actions, and the transformed institutions she had helped reform. Her presence alone, her unwavering commitment to fairness, and the relentless pursuit of truth now commanded the ultimate respect. Sophie Albright had not just served justice, she had fundamentally reshaped the landscape, ensuring that the skies, and the pathways to them, truly echoed with the promise of safety, equity, and impartiality for all. She was, and always would be, the quiet hammer that broke down walls of prejudice, building bridges of justice in their place. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that courage can alter destinies, and that light always finds a path even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss our upcoming stories.